talking, and when it does start kind of broadcasting, I'm chatting away. So, but let's make a start. We're on to Matthew chapter 2 today. So we've got through a whole chapter so far. Now let me just get my Zoom screen back up so I can see folks. Good. What I will do is I'm going to paste the text into the chat so you can follow along that way. So let me just control copy, and then if I come over here, so I've been using Zoom for a year now, and I'm still kind of still never. Oh, there we go. There's the chat button. Right. Let's just say okay, and so I put the text into the chat as I'm using it. As I touched on last week, if you weren't here, this is the text is something I've actually put together myself, working from the source Greek, towards the integrated gospel that I'm producing. So this is my version of Matthew. So feel free to criticize it. It's not superb. I think it's good, but that's that's my bias. So Matthew chapter 2. So now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of King Herod, behold, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. So I'm just going to draw a stop there. It's interesting that you'll often see one of the reasons why scholars often will say, oh, well, Matthew is obviously written after the 60s BC AD. The reason for that is because actually in the early 60s, a group of Magi came to Nero, and that is seen as being, oh, Matthew inserted this part, you see, or this part was inserted because the world knew about them coming to visit Nero. But from a historical point of view, it helps us understand that what the Magi are doing in Matthew's gospel is not particularly unusual. It's the kind of thing they did. They would go and see an important dignitary, and they would report to them, which is what they do with Nero, something to do with their horoscope. Now the Magi themselves, Daniel was a Magi. They came out of the Babylonian system. They were kind of wise men, learned in all things, and one of, in particular, was reading the stars. And so they were very into horoscopes. Now, as Christians and as Jews as well in Jesus's day, who didn't use horoscopes, they seemed a bit esoteric and a little bit ungodly. And so the thought anyway with Matthew is it couldn't have been written until after that, and he put it in because of that. But we started to see last week, and this is a really quite important, because I understand that argument, and I take a view, as you know, that Matthew was written early and was the first gospel to be written, following what the church fathers tell us. And within that context, I was quite happy to say, well, maybe this incident got inserted after the incident with Nero in the 60s, you see. So Matthew was written before then, but this bit then got bolted in. And it's true, you can kind of lift out verses 1 to 12 of chapter 2. And if you read from the end of Matthew 1 and just went straight on, you could kind of leave it out. But as you will see, it really fits. And once we've spotted that last week, Matthew started to position the story of Mary as a virgin giving birth within the framework and the concept of the Jewish traditions around Moses's birth. So if you remember, in Moses' birth story, as recounted to us primarily through Josephus, but we draw in from other sources, that the story was that actually that Moses' father had been visited by an angel while he slept, and we saw that pattern being replicated in Joseph. So Joseph looks like Moses' father, and we saw how that fitted the flow of Matthew's gospel. Matthew as a scribal Levi who has sold out, and like his namesake in the Old Testament, sorry if you missed these ones earlier, we were looking at them in the last couple of weeks, just as he had a scribal namesake in the Old Testament who had kind of abandoned his Levitical role as a scribe and married a foreign woman, it seems like. It seems that maybe Matthew, who is also called Levi, is representing something of that. And we saw how the genealogy actually suits his scribal background. And then he starts as a scribe to kind of tell the story of Jesus, showing fulfillment of prophecy from Isaiah, but also telling the story in a context where it looks a bit like the way Moses gets born, where an angel visits his father while he sleeps and he has a dream about Moses. And that theme continues, because actually, if we run through this passage that we're going to read about the Magi, we actually find that it looks again very similar to the story of Moses' birth as told in Jewish culture, not told in the Bible, but actually as a scribe. Matthew, from a Levitical scribal family, is fully aware of these stories. He teaches from these stories. He would draw them together. And we're going to see that a little bit more. I had a quick context. Oh yeah. So really what Matthew is doing is not, as he's been accused of sometimes by scholarship, of saying, oh, well, the Jews weren't interested in astrology, so they would have ignored this story. But actually, it's in the flow of there being something that's much more like a new covenant that's coming, just as how Moses was born, and there are parallels in the birth of Jesus with the birth of Moses. In our kind of cultural story. Now, there's another take that is also critical of the Gospels, where they say, oh, well, that's because the Gospel writers just went and invented the story to fit their kind of patterns of reference, if that makes sense. So there was a book published a few years ago which had 4 perspectives on the Gospel narratives, and one, it was a kind of a traditional Christian one. Oops, hang on, what's going on there? Is that me? No, I don't know. Okay.
Might be worth you muting everyone, Kristen.
Yeah, sorry, I'll mute everybody. That's a good thought. Let me go back and try and mute everyone. You can turn yourself on if you want to talk. So it just cuts out any of those background noises. Anyway, what were we just saying? Oh yeah, about the way that Matthew is kind of presenting Jesus's birth within the flow of a new covenant. So why it fits the parallels with Moses. So in the Moses story, it's an Egyptian scribe that says to Pharaoh about the prophecies of a leader coming, and it's because of this prophecy, which Pharaoh then discovers, that Pharaoh goes and instigates the rule to kill all of the children, you see. And of course now Matthew himself doesn't actually tell us about the hang on. So anyway, but yeah, so Pharaoh responds very much like Herod does. It kind of matches the parallel. That's right. I was telling you, wasn't I? I lost my train of thought. Now I've just remembered. I was telling you the 4 kind of approaches. So one is a kind of traditional Christian view. One was a kind of that humanistic kind of Christian view, in the Jesus Fellowship. There was a real person, but the stories get embellished. And I can't remember what the 4 was, but one of them was the view that the whole gospel was constructed by people looking at the literature, looking at the Old Testament and bolting them together and writing the story from scratch. And interestingly, when that view was presented, people then looked at it and said, well, it's the wrong way around. In actual fact, what you find in the Gospels is common of anybody significant in the ancient world, which is that the writer very often selects events from their lives which actually are illustrated by things from history, if that makes sense. So that's really what Matthew is doing here. He's doing what's common in the ancient world, which is if I've got something that happens in someone's life and there was a prophecy that sounded a bit like it, or somebody famous in the past behaved a bit that way, I choose that event and I present that because of the connection. And so really that's what Matthew is doing here. He's telling the story of the birth of Jesus. He's already highlighted its new creation, as we've had that as the virgin birth. So just as we saw that the whole of the Gospel of Matthew starts with the book of the Genesis of Jesus, and then it has 7 sets of 7 people, except the last set is headed and completed by Jesus. Jesus represents the last set of 7 everybody's. So 14, 14, 14, which is 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, and then it's Jesus. So we had 7 days of creation getting represented by 7 sets of generations. The book of Genesis. now here comes Jesus as a new creation. So it's not that God's had sex with someone, he's actually created fresh, and the Spirit has brooded over, just as Joseph brooded over. We saw the language. And now it's producing a child whose birth is matching similarly the things that we know about of the birth of Moses from traditions. And he presents it in those ways. So if I come back to the text a little bit, I think it's totally in flow of Matthew's Jewish nature, if I can put it that way, Matthew's scribal nature, the way he's writing. But there are things that we would particularly miss in it. What's interesting as well is we also know that this story presents Jesus in a way that reflects contemporary with Matthew's messianic thinking. During the kind of Maccabean expansion, rebellion, and so on, and there was a particular leader who takes the name Ben Kochbar, Ben Kochbar, which actually means the son of the star. So he kind of takes as a prophetic name the title, the son of the star. And that is because the very oldest, in a lot of Jewish thinking, the oldest messianic prophecy in the entire Bible is given in Numbers, which talks about a star will arise in Jacob. And that's that star, and it talks about that star that will arise in Jacob, which will be for the whole world. That prophecy is given by Balaam, who was a Gentile prophet, which is perhaps not to be missed here. And that idea of the star, as the leader who is the star, or the son of the star, was in Messianic thinking. We find it in the writings from Qumran, for instance. So again, Matthew is fitting within and trying to draw attention to things in Jesus's life that actually help connect and see a lot of this kind of prophetic ideas, focusing in on who Jesus is. So that's a lot of background. And I'm trying to do these without too much kind of study before I do them, just to kind of talk out of memory and out of just the flow, because it makes it easier for me and gives them a different feel. But let's get back to the text. So these wise men, they come from the east to Jerusalem, and they're asking around. So it doesn't say they go straight to Herod, saying, where is the one who's been born King of the Jews? Because we saw his star at its rising. Now, I've translated the word east the way it is literally in Greek. That, as is common in several languages, the word east is actually the word for to rise, and that is because the sun rises in the east. So the direction which we think of as east is where the sun rises. So the word is rising, and we kind of dependent on context, we translate the word as east. So when it says Jesus was born in Bethlehem, wise Magi, behold, Magi from the east came. In English, we're translating that word there as east because that's the direction they came from. But now it's a little bit more ambiguous. They saw the star. Is it in the east or at its rising? And the reason I flag that is because in the ancient world, in the astrological world, at its rising is what planets do. And planets are called stars, but the difference is, unlike normal stars in the sky, planets rise, like the moon rises, like the sun rises. Does that make sense? So in actual fact, what the Magi are saying is we saw his star, a wandering star, a planet as we would call it, almost certainly therefore Jupiter, which was seen as the king-making star. We saw it at its rising. What they're saying is, when we're really into horoscopes, and we think it's very significant the things that are happening, particularly with the planets and how they're rising on the days that people are being born or conceived. Does that make sense? So it's actually, if you put it into context with our understanding now, you find that phrase is used in astrological writing from the 1st century by real Magi as referring to what's referred to as a dawn rising of a planet, a helical rising. So they saw something going on. And as a result, they have seen something significant, which what it's telling us is they've seen a significant horoscope. And there are various ways, and we'll see there's more of this in verse 9, where we find several astrological words used. But I'll come to that. But I'll just kind of highlight. So although the Greek word is exactly the same, I've translated it in two different ways in English, because I think the context kind of reflects that. They come from the east, but when they talk about the star, they're actually talking about seeing a planet do something, which is in keeping with the fact that they are magi. We saw his star at its rising, and we've come to worship him. And then we hear when King Herod heard this. So they haven't gone straight to Herod. They've just turned up in Jerusalem, and they're asking around, which means it's perhaps not a huge delegation. And Magi represent a vast range of kind of. They're all educated, but they're, in terms of wealth, they represent a bit of a spectrum. So they've turned up and they're asking around, and word comes back to Herod. Now Herod does have a very highly developed spy network, so that shouldn't surprise us. He has people in every town whose job is just to feed back to him. He is highly paranoid at this point. This is probably between 7 and 4 BC. He dies in 4 BC. And from 7 BC onwards, there were all sorts of things going on in his family to do with succession and who's coming after him. If we were looking at Luke's gospel, I would touch on other elements, but we're not going to touch on those tonight. And actually, he's even executed a couple of sons at this point. And there's a lot of he's had 10 wives, and they've got sons all over the place, and they're all infighting. But actually, he is incredibly insecure, not least because we know from Josephus that just at this point when these things are happening, the Pharisees have started to prophesy that he will be succeeded by a son from his brother's line, not from his own. And so he's very suspicious of that situation, and doesn't know quite how to deal with it. And in this context, suddenly there are Magi asking about a king who's been born, if I put it that way. So not surprisingly, we read, then King Herod heard this, and he was unsettled, and all Jerusalem with him. And that all Jerusalem with him would probably be reference that Matthew is making to this fact that we pick up from Josephus, that actually the family is in quite a nervous place. The ruling families are in a place where he is beginning to execute those who are speaking in ways he doesn't like, to do with his succession. So the last thing we really want is everybody is now under suspicion who's had a baby, if you've got Magi turning up and saying, we've got a prophecy going on about this. But we kind of read on. So having assembled the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. So this is happening without the Magi there. Herod has just heard about their presence asking questions. He is starting to gather information, and he picks up, and they said, Bethlehem of Judea, because it's been written through the prophet. So that makes it even more nervous. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, though you are no means least among the rulers of Judah, out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd. It just says shepherd there. Obviously, didn't copy the whole thing. Shepherd my people, Israel. So quoting from Micah, of course. And it's interesting because Micah has prophecies which relate to the shepherds, but Matthew doesn't tell us the shepherd story. He just tells us the prophecy from Micah. So Herod called the Magi privately. So he sends out word, says, I want you to come and meet with me, and learn from them the exact time that the star had appeared. So a thing to notice here is that this isn't actually at the birth of Jesus. We've already covered that in the previous chapter. Virgins conceive, have a child, she's had a child. And now it's after Jesus was born. So some period after that. And in that context, Herod is looking back, trying to work it out. And we know, of course, from Luke's gospel that it's children under 2 he goes for, which probably means it's a year or so after Jesus is born, or at least a significant chunk of the year after Jesus has been born when this is happening. So he called the Magi and learned the exact time that the star had appeared. That issue is not the exact date. It really probably is the exact time, because that makes significance as to the meaning of the astrological predictions. Now, on a personal level, I'm not pushing it here, but on a personal level, I'm convinced of the view taken by an astronomer who was a retired astronomer who first proposed one of these things. Various biblical scholars have pointed out that the words used in Matthew are all astrological terms. There are 3 words, different words that are very specifically astrological words. So it's clearly an astrological sign. There's a famous comet in 5 BC, which could kind of fit. But more significant was this by this astrologer, Michael Molnar, who highlighted there is a very significant horoscope that appears in 6 BC, which predicts a divine ruler in Judea. You can trace all of the meanings of everything that happens in it. And there's a Christian view of this that puts it into about 1 BC that is not actually based on historic evidence. It's a kind of a reinterpretation. I sound very rude when I say that. I totally understand why people find it appealing, but it wouldn't cut any weight with real historians, if I put it that way. But there is one that genuinely does. It is about 6 BC. So that actually fits. It doesn't always fit with the way we see Jesus being about 30 when he starts his ministry, but it does fit with everything else we know historically about the timescale and timeline of Herod and what's going on with him. So this would perhaps be around there. So that's the time that the star had appeared, and so he then sent them to Bethlehem. Now Bethlehem is just literally 20 minutes away from Herod's palace. So if Herod has called them for a private meeting in his private apartments, which is there on the west side of Jerusalem, you pop out of the west side of Jerusalem, and it's just about 20 minutes down the road, and you get to Bethlehem. So he sends them to Bethlehem, but that doesn't mean that that's where Jesus is. Remember, there's a period of time since his birth at this stage. And not only that, we also then read, so he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. After you found him, bring word back to me so I can come and worship him too. We know that that's not what he really wants. And I only got, and after they heard this from the king, they went on there, and then let me paste the rest of this in. Here it is, right? So where have I got? Okay, so from here, right? Let me cut and paste the last part in. Okay. So he sent them on their way. Yep. So when trying to just scroll back up so I can read what I've just pasted in. So he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search and bring the word so I can worship him too. And after they'd heard the king, they went on their way. But the star that they had seen at his rising led them forward. And the Greek word there, which is go before or lead before, is again used astrologically. And it actually refers to what in modern terms we refer to as when a star goes retrograde. Normally, a planet moves across the sky night by night in a certain direction. But because of the way that the Earth is rotating around the sun as well, there is a point where it seems to go in the opposite direction, which means it's actually moving in the same way that the stars are moving. So most of the time it's moving against the stars, and then it turns around and changes its direction. And in the ancient world, in astrological terms, they referred to that as leading before. So when we read here that as the Magi went, the star which they had seen at its rising is suddenly in a retrograde motion, which is significant to astrologers. And so they rejoice. But what that tells us is they were at least 2 nights traveling, which means Jesus isn't found in Bethlehem. You see how you put the things together. It takes 20 minutes from Herod's palace to the edges of Bethlehem. But they take at least 2 nights because they're measuring and seeing that the star is moving in the opposite direction. Just as a kind of an interesting thing to note. And then, so it's moving the opposite direction, led them forward until it stood over. And again, that little word stood over is what in modern terms we refer to as stationing, which is when a planet has been moving in the opposite direction to the way it normally moves, it's going to turn around. But for about 2 or 3 days, it appears to be stationary in the sky and doesn't move. And that is referred to in the ancient world in astrological terms as standing over. So Matthew is using proper astrological terms to describe real phenomena, which is significant to the Magi, but does tell us that where they eventually find Jesus is not Bethlehem. If we fit that together, perhaps with with Luke's account, we might say it must be up in Nazareth, because it talks about him returning to Nazareth after his presentation at the temple. And so perhaps the flight to Egypt takes place from Nazareth rather than from Bethlehem itself. You see how you fit the things together. So nearly there. And so when they saw the star, they rejoiced overwhelmingly with great joy. And coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they fell down and worshipped him. And they opened their treasures, and they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and of myrrh. And having been warned in a dream that they shouldn't return to Herod, they withdrew to their own country by another route, which actually, if they're up in the north, is much, much easier to bypass Herod than it would be if they were down in Bethlehem, just as a simple little thing. They move on. And at this stage, Herod seems to forget about it. He's got lots of other things to worry about in terms of his succession. In 5 BC, there will be a famous comet. Now, on the whole, Jews didn't notice astrological signs, but they did notice comets. And comets were seen as a sign of regime change. And it may be that comet in 5 BC is what prompted him then to realize, hang on, we never heard back from those Magi, and then go and send soldiers down to Bethlehem to destroy the innocents, to kill the innocents. Putting the story together in those ways. Which actually, of course, we're going to do next week, isn't it? So I should stay away from them at the moment. So if you kind of try to sum up where we've got to, what we can see is that the story of Jesus's birth, the first half, the way Matthew described it, does actually fit with the second half, because together they kind of create a parallel with the birth of Moses as told by Josephus. The words that Matthew is using are proper astrological words, the kinds of things he might, as an educated man, as a scribe, pick up himself. It's interesting that it refers to Herod calling the priests, the high priests, and the scribes as well. Actually, maybe some of Matthew's scribal background means he has connection with some of those who were actually present when this incident took place. The fact that it's not recorded in secular history is totally trivial and irrelevant. Something like this wouldn't be. But Matthew may know the story because he himself is from a scribal family, and scribes were involved in the conversation with Herod at this point. And so perhaps this is part of the way in which the story has come to us via Matthew. So again, what I just really wanted to draw out as we kind of put all those things together is one, that the gospel holds together nicely. It makes sense if you understand the person who's written it. And the flip side is how you actually see Matthew, the professional version of Matthew, with his scribal abilities, his scribal skills, his numeric skills, kind of coming together, both drawing together prophetic context from the Old Testament, significance of patterns and so on, and his ability and access into the scribes around Herod. All of those things are coming together in a way that doesn't prove the traditions are true, but actually the traditions make an awful lot of sense of, if you put it those ways. And always for me, as I say, part of my love for the Gospel of Matthew is it kind of shows how our professional skills can be used by the Lord. And we might have our own different ways of doing it and thinking about it, but he does do that. He uses those things in those ways. So I'm going to draw the teaching bit to a bit of a close. So you can unmute yourself if people would like to ask questions or make a statement or ask anything at this stage before we stop the stream and just take a moment to pray for each other.
Just one anecdote.
Oh, hang on. Who was that?
Steve.
Steve.
Am I coming up on screen there?
Yeah. Let me unpin myself now so that then you can come up on screen. How do I unpin myself? Well, go ahead and.
Yeah, anecdotally, and I can't remember where I read it, but when the Muslim armies approached Bethlehem in the 8th century, whenever it was, and came to the the cave of the Nativity or church of the Nativity, they decided not to raid it and violate it because they recognized by the headgear that the Magi were wearing headgear that came from Persia.
Uh-huh.
So it sort of gives a little bit more credibility to the fact that there were real Magi coming from that direction and recognized by the invading Muslim armies in the 8th century thereabout.
Yeah, no, it's very, because actually, at that point at the beginning, they're Magi from the East. One of the theological elements that I didn't touch on that perhaps Matthew is drawing in comes from Psalm 72, which talks about kings worshipping, which is why we sometimes turn the Magi into kings. And there it talks about Magi who come from the East, from the West, and also from the South, and then others as well. But these are very specifically from the East, which is where the Magi all originated. Under the Greek diaspora, there were Magi in isolated pockets all over the empire, but they were concentrated around the Babylonian area, as Steve was saying. Yeah. And of course, Daniel is actually referred to as Rab Magi, which is the chief of the Magi. So actually, even in their own histories, which they would no doubt maintain, they have perhaps the prophecies of Daniel within their own kind of context and text. So it's good.
They show to Alexander the Great when he arrived as well.
Yeah. There's a great story about Alexander the Great, of course, being shown the prophecies of his victories.
Correct.
In the Old Testament, which is a fantastic story. Because
we've got a question now, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
When you actually talk, just to give you some feedback, you actually bring it. You do bring it alive in a way that's not aggressive, which is great. I know there's a lot of aggression in the Old Testament and all bits and pieces. And what would be your view of if this was all played out now, right? The birth and all this stuff. I know it's one of those $1 million questions, but I think I've noticed some theologians or some preachers are it's in my Bible sort of language, it's there, look, it's in black and white. But, sometimes emotionally, intelligently, you can't really get your head round from the perspective from the past to bring it into our nowness, if you like. What's your view on that when you've actually dealt with students raising questions whether intellectually they can't get around this point, or to say it was a stable, it was a headpiece, it was whatever? We get to the minutiae detail, but miss the essence of Christ. What's your view on that, sir?
So I take a view, which I think is just generally a good communication technique, which is, and there is absolute truth, but actually any one of us always has a bit of a perspective, and there are always elements which we can't unravel. So therefore, I come with a kind of a level of humility as I'm offering what makes most sense and helps me see the world most clearly, which is why I'm such a big fan of that verse, not verse, I call it a quote by C.S. Lewis. It's not actually his quote. It was inspired by him, and I said it so many times, I think he did say it, but he didn't. But the way I put it is, it's not so much that I saw the light and found Jesus, but I found Jesus as the light by which I better see everything else. There is a kind of a sense in which you come with the humility that says, well, I see it this way, and when I do, everything fits together better. Whereas if you want to see it another way, that's fine, but let's work out how that starts to break down. Yeah. If you want to become so cynical and critical about your sources, so tell me what sources you would accept. Well, actually, these sources are better than the records of Julius Caesar. Do you see the sort of thing I'm saying? Yeah. I'm not proving perfection. I'm not proving that it's easy. I'm not saying that I understand every cultural nuance. There are clearly, if I give you a quick example, which hopefully will not upset anybody, if you statistically, all of the ages in the book of Genesis are all divisible by 5, or they are divisible by 5 if you've taken the number 7 off them, every single one of the significant ones. The probability that was the way they died, unless there was obviously a divine pattern to it, is pretty much 0. It's ridiculously small. But what it tells us is that probably the original context, the numbers represent something, because we know that from other ancient cultures. So it's kind of universally accepted is that very often these very large ages in other cultures embodied some truth, because numbers in the modern world almost universally mean quantitative. But even in the modern world, a number means both quantitative and qualitative. You know, if I say there's a dozen or whatever, I can sometimes, or in a fortnight's time, I will use a word in a qualitative sense, perhaps slightly more than quantitative. As you go back through the centuries, you find that that combination becomes much more half and half. So for someone to die at age of 40 means they've lived a full generation kind of thing. Now, did they really live to 38 and a half, or did they live to 40? You see, that's where, well, we measure that really easily. But actually, have you ever worked out how hard it is to remember what year something happened in? If I look back, someone asked me earlier about, how long have you had the computer? I think it's about 3 years. But if I try and remember when I got it, all I can tell you is I remember getting it just before Christmas. I can't tell you which year it was, if you see what I mean. And so in an ancient world, those kind of these symbolic meanings in those numbers plays out a bit more. I can't tell you exactly, therefore, how that will work, because we just have lost that knowledge. Does that make sense? Yeah. But I can understand that when it was written, it was understood as true, and it meant something. But I couldn't 100% tell you exactly that I know what that means, if I can put it those ways. No. So I try and come at these things with, if I see it this way, it makes best sense, like the virgin birth. It's not a good apologetic, but if God was going to break into human history as a real human being, not just as an avatar, he'd have to be via a baby. Who would his dad be? Well, virgin birth makes sense if God's going to break into human history. Does that's not saying the virgin birth proves that Jesus was God. It's saying that actually a virgin birth is what you might expect if God was going to do what we think he did in Jesus. The whole thing is turned around. Is that helpful?
No, of course it was. No, it's brilliant. It's just, no, Christian, no, you'd explain it well. It's just that it's a shame that there's not a godometer out there to say anything that we do that's remotely Christian. Do you know what I mean? Where there's this big God, a big voice